Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the ICANN APAC-TWNIC Engagement Forum. The session will begin. This session is WHOIS, the Privacy, Trust, and Public Interest. And we have our moderator here, Mr. Xie Mingyang, and Joyce Chen, the member from ICANN, Alban Kwan from the CSC, Crystal Peterson from the New Star, and Henry Tsai from the Intellectual Property Court. Now, please applaud to welcome them onto the stage.
Yeah, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the first session this afternoon. The topic is WHOIS privacy, trust, and public interest. And as you know, the European General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, came into force on May 25th, 2018. And organizations that are not compliant could face heavy fines. GDPR is the most important changes in data privacy regulation in 20 years. And GDPR has fundamentally reshapes the way in which data is handled across every sector, from healthcare to banking and also to domain system, especially the WHOIS system. In response, the ICANN community is undergoing an expedited policy development process, EPDP, to get in line with the GDPR requirements. And this session will look further into the impact of GDPR on WHOIS, how to balance the privacy and the public interest. That will be very important. And this afternoon we have 4 speakers. It's our great honor to invite them to give a talk. The first one is Joyce Chen. She is the Senior Manager, Global Stakeholder Engagement, Strategy and Development. Joyce joined ICANN staff on February 2016. She currently serves the organization as GSE Strategy and Development Senior Manager in the APAC Hub. And the second speaker is Alban Kwan. Alban Kwan he is now CSC Digital Brand Service Country Manager for Greater China, based in Hong Kong office. Alban has developed a deep understanding of online brand protection, digital assessment management, and cybersecurity. And the third speaker is Crystal Peterson. Crystal Peterson is the Senior Director of Global Registry Service for New Star, one of the world's largest registry service providers, with nearly 250 top-level domain extensions under management. And the last one is Judge Henry Tsai. Dr. Henry Tsai is currently a High Court Judge at Taiwan Intellectual Property Court. Judge Tsai holds a Master of Law degree in Public Law from Suzhou University in Taiwan, and LLM degree in John Marshall Law School in the US. And he also obtained his JSD degree from the Jiao Tong University in Taiwan. And Judge Tsai has a comprehensive interest in many legal fields, and one of his expertise is in the internet governance. I think we have about 80 minutes in this session. I think every speaker will have 15 to 20 minutes to talk. So let's welcome the first speaker, Joyce Chen, with applause.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm Joyce Chen. I'm from the ICANN APAC Regional Office. ICANN stands for Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, and I want to thank the organizers for this forum, TWNIC, for joining hands with us to have this engagement forum, and I think it's very meaningful. I hope it's also very meaningful for you and that we all go away learning something that we did not know before today. So I've been asked to talk about the GDPR. Who knows about GDPR? Who has heard of it before? Good. So we don't have to talk very much, actually. We just let you ask questions. Exactly. I'm very pleased to see that. Okay, so next slide. I'm just going to give you... I'm doing the clicking right. Down? Yes. So don't bother reading the words on the text. This is slides given to me. So basically, I just want to give you an overview of the European Union or the EU's GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. Just very quickly, only one slide. The GDPR was actually adopted in 2016. So it only came into force last year. But most people only heard about GDPR starting from just before May last year. So you have to ask, how come this came to be and not that many people know about GDPR until all the news started carrying articles about, hey, the GDPR is going to impact a lot of people. Because basically there are very heavy fines associated with the GDPR. So first you have, if you do not comply and they find out, it's either 20 million euros or 4% of your annual turnover revenue, whichever is greater. So it's not, whichever is the minimal one, then they would just, give you a fine. It's whichever is greater. It could be 4% of your global annual revenue. So the aim of the GDPR really is to protect all EU residents, so citizens and residents, from privacy and data breaches. And it applies to any company that is processing or holding personal data of the citizens and residents within the EU. So, as you know, the GDPR is concerned with how companies will collect, will use, and publish your personal information. For the EU, it's only for the citizens and the people living there, but also around the world now, people are starting to think about something that is similar to GDPR and whether they have such legislations as well in their own countries. And I'm sure in Taiwan, this is also the same discussions that you are going to have. So what does the GDPR have anything to do with WHOIS? Let me tell you a bit about WHOIS first. WHOIS, or also known as the Registration Directory Services, but most of us just know it as WHOIS, is actually an online resource to help you look up who owns which domain name. So it's very simple. You can go online, anybody can access this information, who owns which domain name. At least that was the case before GDPR. Now if you try to do it, you see a very different kind of WHOIS, and I will show you some examples later. So the internet is distributed, it's decentralized. If you think about how the internet works, it's really just a network of networks. So for it to run stably, you need to be able to find the people who are operating it. So in case there are any problems, in case you need to coordinate on operational issues, you know who you're looking for. And historically, this is why WHOIS came about. It's just simply so that we can coordinate with the people who own websites or own domain names. Just as simple as that. So the WHOIS is a critical piece of the puzzle that helps us to do this. So with the GDPR being enforced last year, parts of the WHOIS are now no longer compliant with the GDPR. Because if you think back about the GDPR, what does it mean? So you cannot have any personally identifiable data, so meaning your contact information, you cannot have your address published, available online for anyone to see, with or without your consent. Whereas in the WHOIS previously, all this information was available online. So we had a problem. We have the WHOIS, which serves its function and helps a lot of people connect with the domain name owners, but yet at the same time, we are starting to run in trouble with the law because GDPR would then say this is not compliant. There's a problem here. So what we did in ICANN was to create a temp spec, a temporary specification, to try and keep the WHOIS as intact as possible, because there's still a lot of users for it. People still use it in many different ways for many different reasons. But at the same time, making sure that it's compliant with GDPR. So as you can imagine, there are a lot of different people, a lot of different stakeholders who use the WHOIS for various reasons. It could be law enforcement agents. You know, for security reasons, they need to find criminals using the WHOIS lookup. Whether or not it's effective, that's a different discussion, but that is what is being done today. And so a lot of law enforcement will tell you, by taking away the information from WHOIS, now I have a lot of problems with my investigation. We are meeting a lot of blocks. We're unable to run our investigations properly. And this eventually will have impact on national security. We also have your intellectual property, your trademark owners who need to contact somebody who owns the domain name in case of transfers, in case of any trademark disputes. Now it's a lot harder to find somebody who owns that domain name and be able to have a resolution with that person. So there are many, many different users. If you can think of how the internet is being used today, the WHOIS is also used in many different ways as well. So what the temporary specification, or what we call the temp spec, because we like acronyms and we like to make everything short form, is to do two things. First, we want to try and maintain the existing requirements to collect registration data as much as possible. So remember I said try to retain as much as we can of the original WHOIS as much as possible. Second, it is to find a way to provide this information to people who really need to access it, people with a legitimate purpose for requesting this information. So in ICANN itself, we actually have a more normal policy development process called a PDP that often takes many years to complete. So in ICANN, because we have the multi-stakeholder model, many different stakeholders come together, and then they develop policy together, it can take many years for a policy to finally reach a stage where it can be then recommended and implemented. But as you know, because of the enforcement of GDPR last year, it triggered a real urgency for ICANN to respond quickly. Because if we don't do that, we end up being possibly in trouble with the law. So the GNSO Council, GNSO stands for Generic Names Supporting Organization. You don't have to remember all these things, but just know that this particular council helps to take care of policies related to generic top-level domains. They agreed that the Expedited Policy Development Process, or the EPDP, is the best way for us to meet this timeline. So instead of going through the normal PDP, which takes many, many, many years, they decided let's do the EPDP instead. And the EPDP is not something that is completely new, something totally surprising. It actually exists in ICANN's bylaws. So it is a proper mechanism for the community to respond and work on issues that have a very urgent timeline. So this is what happened here. So basically with the EPDP, we are not taking a rabbit out of a hat suddenly and go, oh, surprise, let's have an EPDP. It's a mechanism that lets us work in a very strict timeline and deadline. So what the EPDP team is working on now is to confirm whether or not the temporary specification, the temp spec, will become consensus policy. Because the temp spec is just a policy that has been developed to let the community respond to. It has not become the policy yet. So this EPDP team is now working to confirm that. And it is doing it in two phases. So the first phase, which is actually nearing completion already, it's almost finished, was to define the scope of issues. So you define what's on the table first. So for example, what is the purpose of collecting user data? What are we using it for? Are we collecting the data just because we are asked to collect it? Or is there actually useful purpose for it? what is the impact on other policies in ICANN that is currently in effect? So if we make changes to the WHOIS, what else in ICANN will be affected? They also ask questions like, what are the data elements when you're talking about collecting information? So meaning, what kind of information is okay to collect or not okay to collect? So in the first phase, this is what the team is talking about, trying to understand what is the issues surrounding the GDPR and the WHOIS, and trying to find the definitions around these arguments. Now the second phase is for the ePDP team to basically start looking at finding a system where people can then access the registration data that is no longer public. Because right now, when you look at the WHOIS, a lot of information that used to be available online has been basically taken away. It's all disappeared. It's considered like a blackout. So the second phase of the team now is going through trying to see if a system can be developed where we can let legitimate users access this data. And then, of course, you must think about who is considered legitimate. How do we provide this access? Is there such a system which we can allow people to find some way of logging in or something, making a request, and then getting this information? How do you prove that you want this information for a real purpose, not just because you're a bad person or you want to do something criminal? So just very quickly to go through some of the changes in the WHOIS now. One is that personally identifiable data is redacted, meaning that there's a blackout. If you need to contact someone, you can still do so, just not the registrant itself, because that information is no longer there. You have to use an anonymized email and send the email to the registrar, and usually the registrar will have to then decide if this is a legitimate request, and then they would give the information if it is. So this table basically is all the things in WHOIS that we collect and that we used to display online. So if you go to a WHOIS lookup, all this information is basically available online. So on the left, on the middle column, you see before GDPR. On the right side is after GDPR, and then what it looks like now. So not many changes to all the basic information regarding a domain name. But then you start to see things like registrant ID, your address, the registrant address, all these are no longer displayed where previously they used to be. The registrant email, which also used to be displayed previously, has now become an anonymized email or a web form where you have to go through a third party in order to access this information. So the process now is a lot longer because the registrars have a lot of other things to do than just answering people's WHOIS lookups. And as you can see, so both the admin, the administrator, as well as the technical contacts have all been taken away. So it's gotten a lot harder to be able to locate someone, a registrant, if you have any queries or questions about that domain name. So all not displayed anymore. And that's all for my introduction. I hope that was short and sweet. And I'll pass the time back to the moderator. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Judge Chen already mentioned and introduced the ePDP, especially the phase 1 and phase 2, and what will happen after that. Maybe we can only see limited information from the WHOIS system. Yeah, thank you. So let's move to the second speaker, Evan Kwan, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Maybe let me just quickly introduce where I come from and why am I speaking here as well. I represent a stakeholder within the internet group that is more related to brand owners. So CSC and where I am responsible for, we are working with a lot of large enterprises for their own global domain management. So we work with the likes of Apple, Microsoft, Alibaba, for example, to manage their own portfolio of domain names across the world. We also provide some online brand protection monitoring, takedown, and enforcement services for this company. So the way we see that is that we are looking about these particular issues from the enterprise perspective, from the brand owner's perspective. So hopefully it will be a perspective that I honestly think that this particular perspective is not extremely well represented in the ICANN structure. So hopefully we will be able to talk a bit about it a bit more. I do have a presentation, but I think I'm going to skip most of the slide because we don't need to repeat the same thing. Now, skip, and skip, and skip, and skip. Now, this one is probably important. So I think the impact of the WHOIS reduction due to GDPR have at least a couple of problems. And I'll talk about some examples later on using my 8 minutes. First of all, I think Joyce already talked about visibility. But in terms of visibility, I think one of the angles that I think a lot of the enterprises actually experience, but not really well represented at the moment, is that even within the right owners itself, its own organization, for example, a large multinational organization, they usually have like thousands of domain names across the world and managed, and currently probably managed by different people. So if, for example, if there is a particular site that looks like the brand owner site, just pop up, they have no idea whether this is actually legitimate or not. Sometimes they just look at the WHOIS record and see if they can find out who exactly in Brazil, for example, is the employee that is establishing this website but forgot to report to the HQ. No, they just don't know. So how do they actually understand, not only from the visibility from the infringement perspective, but also from the perspective of the internal digital asset management perspective? They have no idea. So they have to, at the moment, they really just have to rely on their own internal management capability to make sure that they know what their BUs are doing. But in practice, there's no way that they can prevent a particular employee just, out of whatever reason, they just decide to do something in that particular country. And how, in practice, would they be able to then keep track of that and consolidate that asset back to their own management? So I guess that speaks to one of the reasons why the original WHOIS record is important, because we're talking about the domain name and the IP address being a resource record on the internet, and resources are owned by someone and is accessed by people, and how do you actually find that resources and who is behind that? Without the WHOIS record and the information with the WHOIS record, it's really hard to gain visibility. The second thing is about dispute as well. Now, this is a good time I bring up one of the examples. It actually happens 2 weeks ago. There's a major China-based video content provider. I won't be able to name them, but they are one of the, we talk about child porn by Edmund this morning, and they are one of the provider that normally are being accused by that. Now, what they told me is that they have hundreds of infringing sites every day, basically. They find a lot of, this site. They just infringing on the brand. But, they recently asked us to see if we can help do some investigation about 2 particular sites that basically copy their video, put their name over there with the kind of the similar content. The domain name are recently registered. The IP address is hidden through a CDN provider, Cloudflare. So there's really just no way for us to find out exactly who is behind this site. Now, this is the problem about dispute. Now, if that particular content contains child porn, the brand name of the provider that I'm talking about will be impacted negatively, because people are going to, what's going to be reported in the news is their brand. And they have no control over this whatsoever. They can't even enforce anything. They can't take down the site without knowing who is behind it. What we told them is that, under the current situation, the only way that you can find out who is behind that site is probably through UDRP. But the problem is, it's expensive. Launching a UDRP is not exactly cheap. And if you only do it for the purpose of knowing whose record, that's extremely expensive. And even so, it's really strange, because to launch a UDRP, you have to construct your whole argument already. But without knowing who are you, going against, how do you construct your argument against someone who you don't even know who they are? This example is a bit extreme, but a lot of the cases for enterprises and brand owners, they are really just trying to find out who exactly behind it. And maybe they are just affiliate of the brand for legitimate interest. They just need to contact them and, stop them from abusing the brand. But without, if you have to launch a UDRP just to know, then it's too expensive. Audit, I already talked about that. Internal audit of the resource record, the domain portfolio of a particular company. Now, these are all very important issues for brand owners, and I think recently we have some discussion among a lot of the Chinese-based internet companies, and they are all really concerned about GDPR WHOIS reduction. The problem is, after we explain to them what's the latest development, it remains like that. Because one of the problems is that some enterprises actually try to go to ICANN meeting before, and the feedback is that I'll never return to ICANN anymore. It's just too scary. And this morning, Redmond, when you mentioned the GNSO, you have to explain that it means generic name supporting organization. Honestly, even if you explain it like that, no one understands what you're talking about. It means nothing. The acronym means nothing, the long name means nothing to most organizations. So that is the problem about ICANN and how enterprises can participate in this kind of discussion, because definitely they're being impacted negatively. But how do they actually advocate? And if they are not comfortable joining in the format that ICANN is having at the moment, that is also linked to the multi-stakeholder model that we talked about today as well. In the current stakeholder model, we already, inevitably selected some representative, because not all people is able to understand the ICANN jargon. So you already have to have representative to participate in ICANN. So how does that actually work? So that's probably where I would finish my sharing.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Alban. And now move to the third, Crystal. Yeah.
Excellent, thank you. Is there a clicker? Is it this one? Yes, it's a little cut off, so please forgive the half words. So I was asked to, oh, that's okay. This one? Okay. Oh, hey, you came back. Excellent. I was asked to share about privacy in the public trust from a registry perspective. Thank you very much, Joyce, for sharing some of the examples of what GDPR looks like. I was saying over here that I hadn't provided any examples, so thank you for that. So getting right into it, from Neustar's perspective, Neustar has a unique position of being both a CCTLD administrator. CCTLD stands for a country code top-level domain administrator, as well as a GTLD, or a generic top-level domain registry operator. And in addition, we also provide registry technical back-end services for over 250 other top-level domains, all of whom have additional policy support, requests, and requirements. So we provide services for extensions, which we call country codes, such as .in, .co, .us, generic extensions like .tel, .travel, or .club, or .biz, what we call city extensions like .nyc, .taipei, or .sydney. And then also we have some brand extensions, as Alvin was just mentioning, like .ibm, or .barclays, or .nike. And all of these extensions have different requirements, different policies, different countries that some of them come from that we're looking at from a privacy standpoint. Excellent. So we support these different registry operators, and we must adhere to the laws and policies of their governments and their stakeholders. So we're looking to allow for a lawful basis for processing that private WHOIS information in the interest of the stakeholders who use WHOIS to get access for performing those legitimate requests, as we have been talking about today, or resolving issues regarding registrations or law enforcement. So we provide both GTLDs, those generic extensions, that are governed by ICANN, as well as the country code extensions that are governed by their sovereign nations, with the ability to implement their privacy policies. For example, we have .tel, who has additional WHOIS privacy policy requirements for natural and legal entities that have been in place for several years, that were already compliant with the GDPR requirements that came in last year. We have .nyc, or .biz, or .club, who have implemented ICANN's temporary specification, but also have their own policies. For example, .nyc has a nexus and a location requirement for registration, and how do we help to also adhere to those policies. We have .co, who implements WHOIS privacy specifications according to the Columbia national privacy laws, very similar to what we were hearing earlier today, that Taiwan has its own privacy laws. So how do we look at privacy from the full spectrum and not just from an ICANN or just from a national perspective? And then we also have .us, who have policies and requirements in the public interest for a full WHOIS with continued full access. Let's see. In addition, for Neustar, we consider the privacy perspective to be part of our overall security requirements as well. We have a platform that provides for centralized security threat detection and investigation and reporting, which is called the Registry Threat Mitigation Service, or RTMS for short. As we mentioned, we love to have acronyms and short phrases. And some of those privacy protection policies, while they are their own policies, they can then seed into the abuse area, as we were hearing before, when we have law enforcement, or we have brand owners and IP rights that are starting to be abused, or we have spammers who are looking to say that they have a legitimate interest in finding WHOIS data, that then starts to seed into our abuse mitigation area. So one of the things that we have to look at is how do we go around and look at from a broad scope, from not only just privacy, but also from an abuse angle as well. So getting into it a little bit. So our privacy protection solutions are looking to not only implement the temporary specification as mandated by ICANN last year, but we're looking to implement a solution that allows for certain country privacy protection policies to also be upheld. And then we're implementing a solution that allows for certain generic extensions to implement the differences in their policies for natural or legal registrations, and then still be compliant with ICANN's mandated policies as well. We believe from our registry perspective that true registrant information should go to the registry if registry policies mandate that. For example, as I'd shared before, .NYC has nexus requirements. And with that, while we do redact what we call the initial WHOIS view, because you can, with a legitimate interest, acquire that information, but the registry still receives that information because it does have nexus requirements and other requirements to be able to check against to enforce its own policies. And it also helps to provide transparency for the operator and for the system as a whole. So for us, registry operators and administrators now decide on a lawful basis for processing that WHOIS information. Given that the nature of the data is sensitive, the use of it is proportionate, so we believe what is the real justification for making that available to anyone at any time. Again, we consider that with the privacy protection, it's that initial WHOIS view, and there is, with legitimate requests, a way to get that information. In the legitimate interest of the stakeholders who use WHOIS to get access, you have a spectrum. You have from law enforcement, you have brand owners, you have IP rights administrators that are looking to be able to enforce laws, to be able to stop child exploitation, as we were talking about earlier. And then you have at the other end of the spectrum, you have potential spammers or bulk email providers that are looking to gather information with unfettered access to be able to do bad acts online. And in the middle there is where each of us as stakeholders have to decide. And from our registry perspective, we believe that each of the contracted parties are now at this moment deciding on their own who has that legitimate interest to be able to acquire the WHOIS data. It is up to every registry and or contracted party for how to strike that balance. And then no matter what Neustar does, every registry client that we have is entitled to make their own business judgment about that legitimate interest. And then we have to weigh the requests of individuals, we have to weigh the requests on an individual basis. So there could be other purposes that are legitimate, which we would review on a case-by-case basis. So looking at being able to provide that WHOIS or the RDDS data, for the extensions that Neustar provides services for, we review the requests through an access point, as Joyce was sharing earlier today, with the fact that there is a WHOIS web form where you can acquire that data. It's considered on a per domain basis for those legitimate requests. We do, from the extensions that we run, look from a review and act on a prompt basis. and then we refuse if an explanation for why access is requested is not provided, or if domains were not owned by our extension. For example, in .biz, we've received requests for .com domain names. Well, we cannot provide that access because we don't run the .com registry. So those types of requests are rejected, as well as if you do not provide a legitimate interest. We have gotten some web forms that have said just cause. That is not something that we consider a legitimate interest. There is review of looking at what we call RDAP access, so providing authenticated access. That is still under review and provisioning from one of the country codes that that Newstar manages, .co. We have done some initial access and authenticated access for Colombian law enforcement, which has been going very well, and so those tests have been successful, and so we are confident that we can move into authenticated access for legitimate parties. So that is mine, and I will turn it back over.
Yeah, thank you for your introducing so detailed about your company. So the last speaker will be Henry Tsai. So please, he already also provide some slides, PPT. Yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone. Both Alban and Crystal introduced their company, and I'm not going to introduce IP Court. I'm here not because I'm a judge, but I just completed my PhD dissertation last year about the internet governance. So if you ask me what stakeholder I stand for, I will, instead of law enforcement agency, I would like to say like, I stand for academic organization or academy. Here is my presentation. Today, this session, we discussed about privacy, trust, and the public interests. And my focus is on public interest. So what is the public interest, and how do we balance the public interest, the pursuing and the protection of civil rights? The civil right here is mostly about the privacy, and just like the Alban said, there are a lot of need to access WHOIS database, because there's a lot of public interest need to pursuing. But at the same time, we still have to protect the civil rights, especially about the privacy. So we need to know what is the public interest. And we ask this question in the ICANN WHOIS context. And just as Joyce introduced, the final report of EPDP team on the temporary specification for GTLD registration data was published on February 20, 2009, just 2 months ago. And in this report, we can see that some group statements. And the most interesting here is that you can see that the totally different standing about the final report. Even they are all the composition or the basis of this team. For example, you can see the NCSG and the GAC is in totally different standing. The NCSG stands for non-commercial, stakeholder group. And they think that disclosure registrants data to the third parties actually is not a valid ICANN purpose. They don't think that the registrant needs to disclose their personal data to the third party. But like today we discussed, there's a lot of legislates need to assess such kind of data. But at the same time, the GAC is Governmental Advisory Committee. They said that the draft final report does not sufficiently recognize or incorporate recommendations in the public interest. So probably they think that for the public interest's sake, we need to disclose more or have a better mechanism for those people with legitimate purpose. So here's the question is, who has the power to define the public interest, especially the public interest in the internet and in the WHOIS policy? So in the past, states governments is the monopolist of public interests. Last week, the WHOIS just held. And in 2003 and 2005, WHOIS all have such kind of declaration that policy authority for internet-related public policy issues is the sovereign rights of states. They have rights and the responsibility for international internet-related public policy issue. So the sovereign states think that they are the only one who have the public policy rights. Probably they don't think that ICANN does. But the new development in the international relations, many international private actors also pursue different kinds of public interests. We can see such argument from a scholar whose name is James Resonu. He wrote a book called Governance Without Governments, Order and Change in the World Politics. So many private sectors also pursue the public interest, and ICANN is the ideal example. So like we can see in the ICANN's bylaw, the core value of ICANN is seeking and supporting broad, informed participation, reflecting the functional, geographic, and the cultural diversity of the internet at all levels of policy development and decision-making to ensure that the bottom-up, multi-stakeholder policy development process is used to ascertain the global public interest, and those processes are accountable and transparent. So we can see here that to pursue public policy, also the core value of ICANN. So I can say that from the diversity participation and the bottom-up policy development policy can form what is the public interest. So this graph is from my PhD dissertation. I just try to introduce or to explain how in the ICANN's organization structure, ICANN use a pluralistic democratic method to pursue the public interests. Here is the several supporting organization of ICANN, including the address supporting organization, country code name supporting organization, and the GNSO, just like Alvin introduced just. And here also a large supporting organization. And also GATE is from the government all over the world. And those supporting organizations, they would elect the board member of the ICANN board. And they also elect the member of the nominating committee. And the nominating committee also elects some member in ICANN. And they're still not, and these 4 organizations also formed another unit called the Empowered Community. And the community and the Empowered Community and ICANN board, they have some kind of relationship about check and balance. From such kind of structure, there's no particular organization or person can dominate the policy so that they can pursue the public interest. So here's some elements to pursue the public interest in the internet, including multi-stakeholder participation, due process of policy formation, and a check and balance among supporting organization, board, and the empowered community. So you can see the due process of the policy formation from the GNSO website. So it's a long journey to form the ICANN policy. And you can see the signal of the people here. It means that the ICANN also collect public comments from the all over the world. You can write your opinion to ICANN. And when I pursue my LLM in the States, I have tried to submit one opinion, and it really posts on the internet about the, I believe it's UIS system at that time. So it's a long journey, and everybody can submit their opinion. So it's a due process to form the policy. And we can also see about the WHOIS policy. How do they arrange the multi-stakeholder participation on this policy formation? This is the EPDP team multi-stakeholder structure. GNSO members are appointed by GNSO stakeholder group. And the registry and the registrar stakeholders group, they can appoint 3 members and the 3 alternates. And the business constituency, IPC constituency, and the ISPC can appoint 2 members, and NCSG can appoint 6 members, and LAC, SSAC, they all about the technical group. They can assign 2 members and the 2 alternate. And the GATE also can appoint 3 members. So as you hear today, that our panelists demonstrates those need for legitimate to access the WHOIS database. But actually, in this kind of stakeholder structure, like the NCSG, you can see their standing. They they stand for the privacy very strongly. They even say that access for the third party for the WHOIS database is not the legitimate purpose for ICANN. So I think under this such kind of structure, the public interests can be balanced and forming. And I would like to mention one thing special is that the EPDP team, they make 29 recommendations for the temporary specification of GTLD registration data. And almost all of their recommendation was made in full consensus or consensus. That means different stakeholder group in such kind of structure, they already have some kind of balance. And one thing need to mention here is that in the charter of the EPDP team, it said that for the purpose of assessing level of consensus, members are required to represent the former composition of their stakeholder group or supporting organization or advisory committee, not individual views or position. So it already represents different kind of organization all over the world in the internet. So here is my advocacy. It is also shown in my PhD dissertation, is that since ICANN community puts a lot of efforts, including the participation structure and process, to adjust the WHOIS policy to compliance of GDPR, all sovereign states are expected to give their committee or deference to the final product, or the internet could break into fragments. I think that this is not only my speculation, but it is the real potential risk. Here is some evidence. That's why maybe the WHOIS policy could go fragments, or even the internet itself could go fragments. The letter from the Assistant Secretary from Communication and Information of US DOC, David Radio, to the ICANN board. I remember just last week or last 2 weeks. He said that without clear and meaningful progress, alternative solutions such as call for domestic legislation will only intensify and be considered. It means that the US Congress also can make some legislation, just like GDPR, by their own. And another example is you can see that China is a very different kind country. They have very high intensifying regulation on the internet. So they did like the WHOIS policy is from the private sector, but they have their own regulations on something like WHOIS a database. So in the Article 31 of the Internet Domain Name Management Rule in China, it provides that the registrar should provide the public access to domain name registration data. It means if you are a registrar in China and you registered a domain name for a person from the European Union, and you might meet the conflicts from the regulation from China and from a regulation from GDPR, because the China regulation asks you have to provide public access to the domain name registration data. but the GDPR said you cannot do that. So here's my conclusion. One internet for one world. That's the purpose of ICANN. Brings the tremendous benefits for the human society. It deserves our commitment to preserve it. So that's why I said that the sovereign states should give committee or declaration to the product of ICANN. And at the same time, the ICANN community still have tried their sincere heart to obey the regulation all over the world. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thanks, Henry Tsai. He let us know what is due process to shape or to form the public interest and also the legitimate interest. So that is, I think that is a very important, the key point of this session. But I think now maybe in the phase 2, that probably will be completed in May or June. And in this phase 2, maybe what is a legitimate user will be more clearly defined. And but I think maybe it's not so easy to provide that so clearly or so how to say that? So I mean, will be later a guideline in the ICANN policy for WHOIS system in the phase 2. Can someone answer this question? Any kind of a guideline where they have a written guideline how to define the public interest or follow what kind of process will be the public interest be shaped? Yeah, maybe who can you or Joyce?
So I would try to speak on behalf of the community, although in the position of an ICANN org member, I have to be very careful. So what I understand from the community discussions is at this point, people are more looking towards trying to develop a technical system which allows access in the first place. But then the discussions around who gets access is also being discussed in parallel. So the thing about the EPDP team was a lot of these discussions on unified access and then legitimate access were kind of, how should I say, not the primary discussion first, because the first step was more to define, in the first place, what are the data elements we are talking about. So they hadn't quite gotten into the deeper discussions of who gets access then down the road. Yes, the discussions have been going on in parallel, but not in that formal way that is being done in the EPDP team. But having said that, so now that the second phase has begun and they have a very, very short runway, some of the thinking that has already started beforehand, you know, they were talking at the corridors, is now going to be put in and more formally discussed. So they feel that they are more in a position now to be able to tackle these issues. So, I mean, just to brainstorm on things like law enforcement, that seems to be very clear-cut. But then there's all the operational issues of what if this police officer then leaves the police force? Is there some way of making sure that that person is still being authorized to access this data? So there are all these, how should I say, operational issues for when you provide tiered or layered access. So they have already started discussing and thinking about how it's even possible to authorize people to access the data. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm just trying to add that the authorization itself is probably in highly contentious issues as well. So who is it ICANN who can authorize, who meet the threshold of, you know, the accreditation? Now, if it's not ICANN, I believe ICANN doesn't want to play that role. So who is the one? Now, is it because this is a GDPR related issue? Is that the EU Privacy Commission or whatever authority over there, or is it the individual country that needs to provide that kind of accreditation? But what if no trust exists in that accreditation? So let's just say that if China accredited a lot of dodgy people who can access information, or even in other parts of the world, then there will be, if you leave it up to the local authority, there might be corruption, there might be other issues that kind of taint the accreditation process itself. So if without a centralized kind of policy governing the accreditation process itself, how could that work? And certainly from a brand owner perspective, the brand owners would like to get access as easy as possible if they see an infringement or any violation to their rights. So I think this needs to be balanced, because I think on the other hand, brand owner doesn't want their own staff or information being disclosed as well. So how do you actually balance that? I don't know, but I believe a more centralized government entity needs to be playing that role. ICANN seems to be in the middle of that. So, but ICANN is a community organization, so the community really needs to decide what that means.
Yeah.
I'd say from the registry standpoint as well, we also believe that it's worth exploring to see the viability of that central source being and helping to create what that legitimate interest is, because there's a great deal of value to provide a more consistent and predictable user experience. So from a registry perspective, we would look at that as well. And then just from that model where we do have the country codes also being able to take part in that, in many of the countries look to utilize at least that source to then help create their own policies as well. Having that central source would be a good idea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Henry.
Yeah. Okay, I believe that in the procedure side, the phase 2 will also go all the PDP process to secure that the public interest maintained. And from the substantial side, that's at least the law enforcement agency of every country can have such kind of access. And I remember that in the recommendation of the ETBT phase 1, a team in phase 1, that they mentioned about how quickly that registrar, the registry have to respond to those law enforcement agency when they need such kind of data. So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you. So now it's 3:10. So we have 10 minutes for audience. So I think it's time for QA. Or do you have any question each other? Which one? Please. Oh, you already standing there. Sorry, I did not see that.
Okay. For the question, let me make my own comment. When we're talking about the public interest, actually, it's a very interesting term. We all try to find what is the best, public interest. This is one of the reasons why we want to introduce the multi-stakeholder mechanism. Because the multi-stakeholder mechanism, that means we invite all the stakeholders to come in to express your thinking in particular policy. So if we can get a consensus from the different stakeholders, the multi-stakeholder, including the individual, all together, and we got a consensus, and then might be is a better way to define what is a public interest mean. If you without a multi-stakeholder, then you are only in a one industry or one particular sector or just a government. You cannot find really the public interest because there's a narrow-minded idea. I think that's the reason why the multi-stakeholder was be introduced in the beginning of the ICANN established in 1998. Second of all, regarding for the WHOIS, well, another one is, I also like to explain a little bit. No matter the multi-stakeholder is the best way to express the public interest, it doesn't mean the multi-stakeholder can replace the government or replace the law enforcement. Don't forget that there's a totally different things. During the ICANN institution, of course, ICANN make a lot of policy. And ICANN is not a government. The ICANN is not a legitimate, the law enforcement institution. So how the ICANN developing their own policy is go through what we call is a multi-stakeholder mechanism. We hope all the participants in the ICANN community, we can get a consensus. And this consensus can make the ICANN policy can be processed, can be, put into the stakeholder. And sometimes we can, sometimes we don't, okay? But does that mean the ICANN policy can override the national law? Not at all. We know that. Every government, every law enforcement, they have a legitimacy, can do whatever they want. And so that's part of the reason why the ICANN invite the government body in the ICANN structure. We call Government Advice Committee. So every time when we developing the policy, we like to inform the government. And at the same time, we got advice from government and think about this policy is acceptable. So I think that is a couple of things is not going to confuse the people. Thinking about the multi-stakeholder is making everything. No, not really. Multi-stakeholder in the ICANN structure is developing our policy, the ICANN policy. And that is possible. The ICANN policy not necessarily is acceptable by other nation or government. And we understand that. And back to this topic, we're talking about the privacy, we're talking about WHOIS, and we're talking about GDPR. Actually, during the ICANN community, there is two different kind of opinion. One kind of opinion is ICANN had better have one general contract with the registry and with the registrar. So for the registry and registrar, it's much easier to follow one single contract. But the difficulty is the GDPR is a European commissioning regulation. Not all the countries have to be follow the GDPR. For example, like in Taiwan or in any other country in the United States, your customer is no European. Or, for example, for the European registrant, you can separate it out into another database and follow the GDPR. That means the other part of the database, you can follow your own country's regulation. You don't need to follow the GDPR. Say, I think this is clear. The problem is, and so there's two arguments. One argument is, it better I can just give me one single contract. Another party say, no, we are not European, unit. We are not part of the European commissioning. Why we need to apply the GDPR? That is not our business. For example, in Taiwan, we have a personal data protection law. All we need to follow is a Taiwanese data protection law. do we need to have to follow the GDPR unless your database have some European in there? Or your law might be have some contract, some kind of confuse with your contract with the ICANN. There's a three-party, you can see that there's ICANN here, there's a European GDPR here, there is your country regulation here. So these three can be developing a very complex situation. So I just try to explain, don't confuse the multi-stakeholder mechanism, make everything. No, we are not. This is a multi-stakeholder is doing into to developing the ICANN policy. And regarding who is regarding for the GDPR. And I think basically, of course, if ICANN want to follow the GDPR and put into the contract, let's mean all the registry have a contract with ICANN, they have to follow it too. But this is a argument that is not really clear yet. So, and there's a reason why it's a continual. The PDP is keep going to discuss how to make the WHOIS database contract into the the ICANN and registrar contract. But if you are CCTOD, such as TWNIC, you are the CCTOD, you don't have to follow it because in general, CCTOD, most of them is that they don't have a contract with ICANN. Of course, the TWNIC have a contract with ICANN, but most of the CCTOD do not have a contract with ICANN. Because the CCTOD, in some sense, we recognize them as a sovereignty entity, so we don't touch that. But for the GNS, GTOD or registrar, I think because they have a contract issue, and also they have to follow their own national law. For example, the New Star, you need to follow the US law. There's something like that. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. And we still have 1 minute left. Yeah, please.
Thanks, Guowei. Always giving a lot of insightful comments, and I always learn a lot from listening to you. I just want to respond back to that, and I think your comment really strikes at the heart of the issue, which is ICANN is trying to develop global policy. So meaning a policy that is the same and is standardized for everyone around the world, regardless of where you are. At the same time, as you've mentioned, the policies that are being developed and the contracts that the registries, the registrars have to enter into must also take into account that they need to be compliant with national law. So there is this very interesting tension between now we have global policy being developed and at the same time still trying to be attentive and not doing anything that's illegal. So we don't want to get our contracted parties into trouble as well. And they are also aware of that. So how do we manage this tension? So this is one of the reasons that, being in ICANN and when you are discussing these issues within the community, it's very exciting because then you can think about at what level are we discussing and how does it impact other people who I may not be familiar with. So that's why it's important to have different stakeholders at the table to represent their views, so you have a more holistic picture of what you're arguing about. And so for a very long time, I would say, governments in ICANN were not super active. They kind of know about ICANN, but they're not really paying a lot of attention to what we're doing because they're not quite sure what is going on a lot of the time. And as they've mentioned, it's actually very hard to understand ICANN, the acronyms, and how we actually develop policy. So going back to GDPR and WHOIS, how did we get here today? I think we learned a lot of lessons within ICANN about the process itself. So did we do enough to talk to the European Commission and to the commissioners, the data privacy commissioners, in the first place when they were developing GDPR, to let them understand how the internet works, to let them understand about the open and transparent principles of the internet. So this has caused us to do a lot of reflection. You know, is ICANN doing enough to teach governments, to teach non-technical people about how the internet works? And so when you go home and you're thinking about these internet governance issues, do you understand what is being discussed and why it's so important? So I think for us, it's really been a learning process about trying to engage better with the community and trying to do outreach with all of you so that you're seated there and you try and understand what the issues are, but then hopefully you have an opinion that you can then come and tell ICANN, this is important to me because whatever reason, because my livelihood depends on it, you know, my businesses depend on it. If you take away this information, I can no longer run my business. I'm going to have to close my business down. Or maybe as an end user, you say, no, my principle, my most important principle is privacy, and I want to protect my individual rights. So these are the types of arguments that are taking place and being discussed by the different stakeholder groups within ICANN. So I think that's very interesting, and I thank WHOIS for making that comment, you know, to make ICANN sound very exciting, but also to show you the scale of the discussions that are taking place. These are very serious matters that do impact real people and real lives, and that's what we're trying to do here.
Okay, could I? Sorry.
Yeah, you have 3 minutes to respond.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Actually, during the lunchtime, I talked with Jeff, you know, my old friend Jeff. We're talking about why we need a GDPR. What is a GDPR really for? You know, and everybody said over here, do you think the GDPR is protecting you? Or what is the GDPR really using for? You know, Jeff, I can say that, right? Yep. Could I? We have a long discussion about that stuff. You know, I think basically because we know that right now, I don't know how many of you look at the most popular internet company in the world. In the US, they have called 5 big ones. In China, have a couple of the very big ones. I'll give you one simple data. If you go to the Amazon Alexa to find it, except the China, almost every country, your internet traffic is dominated by 5 companies. The Apple, Microsoft, Google, Facebook, you know, something like that, YouTube. They took almost 60% to 70% of the internet traffic. And we are talking about that. Is that big company definitely is evil or not? Is a big company is evil, you know? And it seems like interesting because those are 5 major big companies. They don't pay tax to anybody. For a long time, you know that Amazon never paid tax, even to United States. Okay, and I also look at the top 20 internet company in the market value. It was surprising. Only 2 countries benefit from the internet: United States and China. Very funny. It's only United States and China. In Australia, Taiwan, how much money we can get from those big companies? The tax, not much, you know. So our argument is that GDPR actually the European try to apply the law to penalize, you know, punish the big internet company. But eventually we find it doesn't work. Because GDPR actually suffer is a small, medium enterprise, it's not the big 5. You know, 5 billion for Google is peanuts. You know, they can pay 5 million anytime, you know, and they still dominate. And this is an interesting issue. I know, of course, it's much over this panel, but I mean this interesting when we're talking about WHOIS, we're talking about GDPR. We might be need to thinking about that. what is really the GDPR using for. And as we, as a individual internet netizen, what we think about that, how we can protect our own right, or what is our right is, This is a much interesting question.
Yes, thank you. Due to the time limitation, so we need to close the session now. So let me thank for presenter, for speaker for their wonderful presentation, and let's thank them with a big applause. Thank you. Thank you.
So let's have a shot here. Okay. Thank you for joining this session with us. We have tea breaks outside. The tea break will be from now to 3:40 p.m. Next section will be ICANN policies, which will be hosted by ICANN. And be sure that on the back of your card you can scan the QR code to complete our survey. You will be able to receive a small gift from us.